everyone! Today we're going to talk about survey research designs, what it is, a purpose, theoretical underpinnings, grounding assumptions, research purposes, examples of research questions, approach to data collection, analysis, formal reporting and evaluating, and assertions made by critics. So we're going to start out with what it is and the purpose of it. So you can see here that it is a type of quantitative research where surveys such as questionnaires and or interviews are used to collect and analyze data about attitudes, opinions, behaviors, or characteristics of a population. Now, when we take a look at this then, remember that research designs can be qualitative or quantitative or a mixed methods approach. In terms of survey research designs, this is definitely primarily quantitative. And that means we take a look at it of a numbered data, we take a look at focusing on trends, patterns, comparing groups. We'll correlate variables, we're going to describe characteristics, and really, when we hand out these questionnaires or we're having these interviews, we're going to have them ultimately rank things. So we might be like, hey, as a teacher, can you rank your feeling about a certain classroom practice from 1 to 5, etc., etc. So ultimately, when we take a look at survey research designs, again, we are taking a look at not specifically manipulating a variable. Rather, we're going to take a look at this in terms of the phenomenon that's occurring and describing that phenomenon using quantitative data. So this leads us straight to our theoretical underpinnings. So our theoretical underpinnings really comes from a research paradigm of post-positivism. So post-positivism is mentioned by Guba and Lincoln and Mackenzie and Knipe, and they discuss the fact that theories, background knowledge, and values of the researcher can influence what is observed. And as a result, you can see here that theories then based upon previous research can change because observation can be fallible and that theory is revisable. Now, the part that it does gather from positivism, as post-positivism is derived from positivism, is the fact that it is an ultimate purpose of still being as objective as possible, and that quantitative research is still inherently better because it allows us to isolate variables, correlate variables, we can still do those internal validity checks, etc., etc. The other thing to kind of note is that post-positivism then is not completely about direct manipulation and observation. Like I said, a lot of it usually is focusing on trends and patterns and looking at that. So when we take a look at other assumptions then, we also then recognize that when we have data in a survey research design, we can actually interpret it and we can relate it to trends back in past research. Again, we focus on this idea of objective and being quantitative, being more accurate, being better, but we also then say that surveys mean that self-reported evidence and these self-reports are then accurate and honest. So this brings us to the types of survey research design. So there's longitudinal, which means over time, and cross-sectional, which is kind of one moment in time. Cross-sectional is the most popular form of survey research design, so I'm going to focus on that kind of right away, and then we'll move into longitudinal. So we take a look at examining current attitudes, beliefs, opinions, or practices, and you can see all these examples here to kind of help you figure out what each one means. You can have them compare two or more educational groups. You can use that to measure community needs. You can use it to evaluate programs based upon perceptions and have a large-scale national survey. Now, that's actually one of the biggest benefits actually of survey research design is that it's very, very efficient, and because of that, it's also cheaper, etc., in order to get data from a bunch of people. So for example, if you're looking at 2,582 universities, you can actually take a questionnaire, you can pass it out to thousands of people, right? And you can really take a look at that in a quick and efficient way, and it's a lot more efficient than, interviewing each and every single individual, and a lot faster as well. When we take a look at longitudinal then, we do have trend studies, cohort studies, and panel studies. So trend and cohort studies are similar in the sense that both of them then focus on individuals that are ultimately changing as they represent the population. So what I mean by that is you're not looking at the exact same 10 individuals. Rather, you might look at 10 individuals or 20 individuals that represent the entire population. So you can see here the example is the Gallup poll used during elections to monitor trends in populations of voters from primary to final election, whereas a cohort, we might study specifically children over the age of 5, but it doesn't have to be the same children over the age of 5 that you're looking at over time. It can be different children over the age of 5. Panel studies then is the one that then examines the exact same individuals throughout. So you might look at two groups, one with learning disabilities, one without, and you might survey them throughout their entire life. And these are the exact same individuals and you're following them throughout their life. So in terms of data collection and analysis then, we already mentioned that data can be collected through interviews and questionnaires. Recognizing that means that it is the participants that are creating this information for you. It is not the interviewer. The most that the interviewer can do is interpret, and that really only happens more with kind of open questions, which we're going to get to in instrument design. But with those closed questions where they might be ranking things, it's ultimately this information is supplied by participants. So that leads us to instrument design, because when we look at questioning, we are expected to use different types of questions. So you want personal, attitudinal, behavior, sensitive questions, open-ended, closed-ended, semi-closed-ended. Now those open-ended questions are really interesting because from a post-positivist perspective, those are the ones that actually enable you to kind of create kind of situational questions as opposed to just a direct ranking. It allows you to kind of open things up a little bit more to possible exceptions or to explore a little bit more of those complex factors. However, most of survey research design is still fairly closed-ended or semi-closed-ended, or looking at trends in terms of attitudes and behavior and sensitive issues. There aren't as many that are open-ended. It is also important that your questioning be clear, that answer options don't overlap, and that all questions are applicable to participants, and most importantly, that your instrument has been pilot tested, whether that be through previous research or whether that be through your own research. It's also important in terms of administering your instrument that the ethics are considered. So you would have to tell them, for example, that as a participant, you have confidentiality and anonymity, your safety and security of participants and researchers is protected. The question is supposed to be as neutral as possible, and the researcher, if they're interviewing, of course, also should be as neutral as possible. And of course, incentives should be not overly large if you want to incentivize people to participate. And then, of course, after the research has concluded, proper handling. So, for example, disposal or shredding of all the information, etc., etc. In terms of a questionnaire response rate, of course, then, because you're looking at numbers, basically the more numbers you have, the better. So the higher the response rate, the better. In general, they look at a 50% or more response rate, and that's what they want. When we look at analysis then, when we want to take a look at response bias, we're going to look at for those general patterns of responses. We might do standard deviation and variance calculations in order to ensure internal validity. We want to make sure that instrument design that we picked from earlier does have internal validity checks within it as well. And we want to keep checking our internal consistency checks, and we want to look at inferential statistics, and so we can do things like chi-squared and all of these different things just to make sure that the data that we have is as appropriate and representative of the population, so that we've gotten a random sample and that sample is representative. In terms of reporting and evaluation, really the key characteristics are all of these. So as long as you report this within your research paper, really all of this comes down to is just as long as you've identified your population, your sample, you have an appropriate sample size, you're going through your procedures from the beginning to the end in terms of administering the instrument and how you're going about the collection and the analysis and your ethics, that's really what you need to have an appropriate survey research design. In terms of assertions made by critics, in terms of drawbacks, basically if you have a constructivist research paradigm, survey research designs do not fit well at all in this sense. And that's because when you're constructivist, there's a value placed in creating experiences and knowledge and meaning making and all of that. So they take a look at the whole idea of being holistic and complex factors of humanity. Now, quantitative research, specifically survey research design, is considered to be inflexible. It doesn't allow for flexibility in answers because of the ranked numbered system. It devalues stories and experiences in terms of how teachers may have gotten to where they are, or students, etc., etc. Doesn't take into account those human conditions, and it doesn't place that value then in those experiences and that knowledge. The other thing with surveys is that people may not answer them honestly, and it might only be a snapshot in time, which means the individual might answer differently depending on their mood. Therefore, you can see that it might be considered weighing too heavily on quantitative results. Ultimately, you have to choose survey research design if you're looking at wanting quantitative research and objectivity. So these are my references, as you can see here. Other than that, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation on survey research designs.